Greetings from my household to yours on this Thursday in Holy Week, the Thursday known as Maundy Thursday. Typically each year I get a question or two about what Maundy means. It, it comes from the Latin word mandatum, which means commandment, and it refers to a passage in the Gospel of John. We've been reading Matthew, but in John's account, in John's Passion story, there is a new commandment that Jesus gives on the night before he dies. And the commandment is this. It comes from John 13, verse 34, where it says, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another." The story of the Passion is the story of the way Jesus has loved us. And so now we continue that story from the Gospel of Matthew. A reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 27, verses 1 through 2, and verses 11 through 31. This reading includes Jesus brought before Pilate. Pilate questions Jesus, a choice made by the crowd, handed over for crucifixion, and mocked by soldiers. You are invited to read along with me on the parts in yellow font. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus in order to bring about his death. They bound him, led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor. Now Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus said, "You say so." But when he was accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you not hear how many accusations they make against you?" But he gave him no answer, not even to a single charge, so that the governor was greatly amazed. Now at the festival, the governor was accustomed to release a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. At that time, they had a notorious prisoner called Jesus Barabbas. So after they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Jesus Barabbas or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he realized that it was out of jealousy that they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent word to him, "Have nothing to do with that innocent man, for today I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him." Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to have Jesus killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what should I do with Jesus, who is called the Messiah?" All of them said, "Let him be crucified." Then he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." Then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." So he released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, he handed him over to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting some thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand and knelt before him and mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. After mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him. Then they led him away to crucify him. The word of the Lord. Then they led him away to be crucified. They led him to the cross. In most of the world, the cross is looked at as a symbol of Christianity. In Christian faith, the cross is looked at as a door to resurrection. And in Christian practice, those of us who try to follow the way of Jesus, who want to follow the way of Jesus, often talk about taking up our cross. For me, at some point in my adult life, I began to look at the cross in a certain way. I began to look at taking up the cross to follow Jesus in a certain way. I began to look at the cross as that place where the brokenness of the world intersects with the goodness of God. When we look at this Jesus that we see in this segment of the Passion story, we see in Jesus the absolute goodness of God intersecting with the relentless brokenness of the instruments of power in the world. We see that intersection between God's goodness embodied in Jesus and the religious authorities who just want to get rid of him. We see that intersection between the goodness of God embodied in Jesus and the political power of Pilate, who isn't quite sure what to do with him, but ends up letting him be put to death anyway. We see that embodiment of God's goodness in Jesus as he stands up to the mentality of a crowd that has run amok and calls for him to be crucified. We see the goodness of God embodied in Jesus as he stands up to the military power of soldiers who mock him. It's interesting as we watch Jesus face all of these instruments of power in his world, power that symbolizes much of the brokenness of the world when power is corrupted. As we watch Jesus do this, he really doesn't seem to have that much to say. What we hear from Jesus is silence in the face of all the words we hear from all these other sources. That wasn't true in some of the other segments that we have read during this Holy Week. Jesus had much to say to Judas, the one who betrayed him. He had many things to say to Peter, the one who ended up denying him. He had things to say to all the disciples who had trouble staying awake. He even had things to say to the temple guards who came to arrest him. But here at a time when it would seem like he would say something to fight back, he meets all of the words of the brokenness of this world with silence. But in that silence, we can feel the power of his presence. And that presence is the embodiment of God's goodness in the face of the world's brokenness. So who is this Jesus when the brokenness of the world is leading him to the cross to be crucified? Who is this Jesus for us when it seems like the brokenness of this world is leading us to places that we do not want to go? If we want to know who this Jesus is, the answer to both of those questions is actually the same. To know who this Jesus is, look at the cross. Because when we look at the cross, we can see where Jesus stands is right at the intersection of the world's brokenness and God's goodness. He stands there with us in our own brokenness, and he will always open the door for us to new life beyond the cross. Blessings on this Maundy Thursday.